Good morning, children, and welcome to your grammar session for Tuesday. Now, this week we're going to be looking at something which we've gone through a lot over the last couple of terms, but it's really important with our writing to show that we can use a variety of different sentence structures and lengths to interest the reader, really. Now, today we're going to be looking at the use of complex sentences, in particular those ones that are composed of a main clause followed by a subordinating clause, or a subordinating clause followed by a main clause. So let's recap about the rules of these things before having a look at doing some independent work with these. So main clauses, the rules of this is a main clause is a group of words that contain a verb and a subject which makes complete sense on its own. Main clauses could also be called simple sentences, which we know them here. Here are the verbs and the subjects in the main clauses below, and they're color coded so you can clearly see what they are. So Karina is the subject, swam being the verb, 50 lengths. The classroom was empty. Classroom being the subject, the verb being was. The family were trekking. Family being the subject and were trekking the verb. So let's have a look at the rules of a subordinating clause. It's a group of words that is dependent on the main clause because it doesn't make sense on its own. When the main clauses and subordinating clause are used together to form a sentence, it's called a complex sentence. Here are the main clauses and subordinating clauses in the sentence below. So the first one, the girls fed the ducks before they walked around the lake. The main clause is the girls fed the ducks. It makes sense on its own. The subordinating clause, before they walked around the lake, doesn't make sense on its own, and it's got the subordinating conjunction before. The next sentence, the windmill sails turned quickly because it is very windy today. The window sails turned quickly is the main clause. It makes sense on its own. Because it was very windy today is the subordinating clause. Doesn't make sense on its own. It's got the subordinating conjunction because. Subordinate clause start with a subordinating conjunction, and I'm sure just having a look at the screen that you're all aware of these subordinating conjunctions. After, unless, although, as, when, even though, until. So these will be really useful for when you're doing your independent work later on. So the rules about the subordinating clause. In sentences we looked at so far, the subordinating clause have been after the main clause. The snow was thick on the ground because it had snowed heavily. Because it had snowed heavily is the subordinating clause. The children laughed happily as snowballs flew. As snowballs flew is the subordinating clause. And as you can see in both of these, we have got the subordinating conjunctions. But as we already know, subordinating clauses don't always have to be after the main clause. So let's have a look. Look at the sentences where the subordinating clause comes before the main clause. Although she hated them, Jenny ate the sprouts. Now, although she hated them is the subordinating clause. Doesn't make sense on its own. It's got the subordinating conjunction, although. The next example, before the campfire was lit, the children were shivering in the cold. Before the campfire was lit is the subordinating clause. It doesn't make sense on its own. It's got the subordinating conjunction. The parts in blue you can see both make sense on their own. That's the main clause. Now, what you may have noticed is the use of the commas after the subordinating clause. So we must add a comma before the main clause if our subordinating clause has started, or if we have started with it. So look at the next slide then. All right, now it's asking you to do something here. Put a tick in the correct column to show whether each group of highlighted words is a main clause or subordinating clause. Now, you don't have to tick, you may just write it in your book or piece of paper, and or just think to yourself, what will each one be? If it starts to rain, is it a main clause is it a subordinating clause? Neil gasps for breath. Is it a main clause or a subordinating clause? Which is native to Australia? Is that a main clause or subordinating clause? Just have a think to yourself. If you need to, just pause the video while you have a think, and which box would you tick before we go to the next slide to see what the answers were. Okay, let's have a look to see if they are subordinating or main clauses. So if it starts to rain, it's a subordinating clause. Now, hopefully you identified the subordinating conjunction if, and we've also got the use of a comma here, which would indicate that this is at the beginning of a sentence and it will be followed by a main clause. Neil gasped for breath. Okay, it makes sense on its own. Therefore, it is a main clause. There's also no subordinating conjunction there either. Which is native to Australia is also a subordinating clause. Which is native to Australia, okay, which being our subordinating clause in this instance. Let's have a look at the next slide then. Another thing for you to think about. How would you rewrite this sentence starting with the subordinating clause? So in this example, David didn't want to wear a coat even though it was cold. We have got our sentence here of a main clause followed by a subordinating clause. Just think to yourself, which part of it is the main clause and which part of it is the subordinating clause? Have a think about it. Right, let's have a look then. David didn't wear a coat is our main clause. It makes sense on its own. Even though it was cold outside is our subordinating clause. Doesn't make sense on its own. And we have the subordinating conjunction, even though. So just have a think to yourself, how can you rewrite that? So we now start with the subordinating clause and finish with the main clause. If you need to pause the video and write it out, please do so, and then we'll have a look at the answer. Okay then, let's have a look then. So let's see if you got what it should have been. So starting with the subordinating clause, it would look like this. Even though it was cold outside, David didn't wear a coat. All right, we've started with the subordinating conjunction, followed by the other part of the clause, and then we completed it with the main clause. Don't forget, we also need to mark where our subordinating clause is with the use of a comma. So hopefully you did really well with that, children. I hope you did. Now, when I talk about this, we talk about manipulating the position of our clauses. And we can do that either having a main sub-sentence or a sub-main sentence. Right, hopefully that was clear. Don't forget, these videos are here for you to watch again if you just need some reinforcement or some support with the independent work. Now, on a separate PDF, which is linked to the plan for today, there's this sheet here, which I would like you to have a go at. There's a number of different tasks there, and it should be reinforcing what the video has been discussing. Brilliant. Well, good luck with that. We've done this before, so use the knowledge of what you've already done. If you need to rewatch a video for direction again, that is absolutely fine. Keep up the great work. See you next week for the grammar session.